Good evening, everyone. The Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC is very proud to present this evening uh, with the wonderful cooperation of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at SFU. We have the very young and brilliant Professor James Horncastle tonight, who will present to you his amazing findings, his research about the Cyprus history from the years that a number of us were not around for, but the older generation definitely would appreciate from 1955 onwards, including the current issues that are happening in the Middle East and how they affect Cyprus as well. Tonight, we are happy to have with us the Honorary Consul General of Cyprus in Vancouver, Ms. Katie Arsoniadis, who will gladly say a few words before we begin tonight. Katie, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is
Thank you,
exciting.
Jaime.
Very exciting. We are happy for you as well because you've basically been for the last year, you have become our Honorary Consul General of Cyprus here in Vancouver, following Ms. Tassoula Bergen, who after many, many years represented the Cypriots here. Anything you want to say regarding the Cypriot community and the connection now, hopefully that will be stronger with SFU as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fanny. I appreciate those lovely words of introduction. I'm very excited to hear the talk today that Dr. James Horncastle has prepared for us. Just a few words about him. What a fantastic person we have at SFU. He's an assistant professor within the Department of Global Humanities and the inaugural holder of the Edward and Emily McWhinney Professorship in International Relations, and a member of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. He has published extensively on the topics of refugee and migration studies, modern history of Greece, international relations, history of Greece, conflict studies, Yugoslav studies, and his recent article, Weaponizing of Refugees, Why Now? In Comparative Studies, examines the potential causes, including developments in contemporary warfare, for the increase of state and non-state actors using migrants and refugees to obtain policy goals. So, wow, I think we're in for a wonderful talk. I want to say a few things about Cyprus and the occupation. It's still divided 50 years on when Turkey invaded the Republic of Cyprus in violation of the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law. And one statement I'd like to read is from the president of the Republic of Cyprus, Nikos Christodoulidis, who says that he pledges that his top priority will be the solution of the Cyprus problem within the agreed framework in order that our country can at last become a reunified, free, contemporary European state, a common land of prosperity, of security for all its legal citizens without discrimination. So top leadership from the Republic of Cyprus. And the last thing I want to end on is our Member of Parliament, Nikki Ashton, last week in the House of Commons, she raised the motion which was unanimously passed, marking the 50th anniversary of the two invasions of Cyprus by Turkey that has led to the ongoing illegal occupation of 36% of the Republic of Cyprus. And in the motion that Ms. Ashton raised, and just of note, she is of Greek descent for those of us that know her, and how very proud we are that she stood up in the House of Commons to make this motion, a resolution which paid tribute to the 33,000 Canadians that served as peacekeepers in Cyprus, And she highlighted the human cost, the missing persons, the displacement of more than 150,000 Cypriots, and made a clear statement that Canada, we not only condemn this invasion, but that we have not forgotten, and we continue to work on the reunification of Cyprus. So on that note, thank you very much for allowing me to participate and be part of this. And I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Horncastle.
Excellent. Thank you both, Fanny and Katie, for those very kind words. Not those who know me, not the best with compliments personally, but thank you so much. But I thought I would just jump into the paper and then we can have a bit of a discussion afterwards about any kind of questions or concerns people may have with regard to topics and ongoing affairs within Cyprus today. Quote, "No one complained of cowardice when we ambushed trucks or killed soldiers from concealed positions in the mountains. But in principle, there is no difference between mountain guerrilla attacks and street killings by the brave boys who formed our close-range execution teams." End quote. In his memoirs, General Yorios Grivas, the individual most crucial in launching and successfully executing the Cyprus liberation struggle, noted a key feature that beguiled the British in their effort to stamp out the insurgency. It was not limited to one area. The various British Army commanders and governors expected to fight the Cypriots in a classical rural insurgency campaign. General Grivas, however, did not meet their expectations. Instead, Ethniki Oryanosis Kyprion Ioniston, EOKA, attacked targets of opportunity throughout Cyprus, and particularly the country's cities, to the extent that the British, who started out refusing to engage with Greek Cypriot demands, were forced to make extensive concessions to the population at the London and Zurich agreements in 1959. Although not all of EOKA's demands were met, given the disparity of forces between the insurgents and the British, it still constitutes an outstanding military success. Furthermore, it provides an important case study on a topic that, though in vogue, possesses a myopic perspective: guerrilla and urban warfare. Urban warfare is a topic about which much ink has been spilled in recent memory. The American experience in Somalia, Iraq, and other countries demonstrate that, as one commentator noted, war, like everything else, has gone urban. The rise of urban warfare caused David Kilcullen, one of the foremost experts in contemporary warfare, to write that guerrilla warfare was moving, quote, out of the mountains. Unfortunately, while urban warfare has gone global, the study of it has not. Instead, the field relies largely on several case studies that, while useful, are largely drawn from the American experience. A few international case studies are drawn from the broader world, most notably Belfast and Grozny, to supplement this perspective. In the case of Belfast, it provides lessons on how to approach counterinsurgency operations. In the case of Grozny, it provides examples of how a conventional army should not operate in urban warfare. While these are important lessons, they are in many ways triumphalist in that they provide a model for Western doctrine success or demonstrate the fallacies of a non-Western opponent. There's much knowledge, however, to learn from one's failures, a lesson the United States, Great Britain, and their allies need to appreciate to develop a viable theory on urban and guerrilla warfare. The Cyprus liberation struggle provides an important case study on the nature of guerrilla warfare, as well as the long-term problems created by key aspects of counterinsurgency doctrine, also known as COIN. EOKA's insurgency efforts demonstrate that the divide between urban and rural insurgencies that has dominated the literature can, in fact, be artificial. EOKA's urban efforts were largely successful due to its ability to maintain forces in the Cypriot countryside. Likewise, the Cyprus liberation struggle demonstrates that state efforts to stamp out insurgencies can create long-term issues that are arguably greater than the initial insurgency itself. In the case of Cyprus, British efforts to divide, rule, and weaponize the Cypriot Turkish population and the Turkish state sentiment created a long-lasting geopolitical imbroglio that continues to undermine it and the broader global North's position in the Eastern Mediterranean to this day. Thus, the Cyprus liberation struggle is a critical study of the nuance of insurgency and the short-sightedness of counterinsurgents. EOKA's insurgency campaign between 1955 and 1959 was an impressive military success. EOKA started with practically non-existent military stock of, quote, 3 Brens, 3 Beretta machine guns, 4 Thompson submachine guns, 17 automatics, 47 rifles, 7 revolvers, 32,150 rounds of various calibers, 290 hand grenades, 20 kilos of explosives with fuse and quote. Furthermore, at their peak, EOKA's active participants consist of, at most, 300 combatants and only 1,000 members of their underground cadre. Nevertheless, EOKA, through careful coordinated attacks, ingenious means of domestic armament production, and maintaining Cyprus's cause in the international media, managed to overcome British intransigence to Cypriot self-rule and the approximately 40,000 British soldiers on the island. While the later political settlements in Zurich and London were indeed questionable and created many of the problems that the island faces today, the military dimension can be considered a critical success. The problem, however, is that the Cyprus liberation struggle is not typically one studied by policymakers and academics today. In order to understand why, one needs to examine how they have discussed the topics of irregular and urban warfare. So as a bit of a background to insurgency studies, governments in what would become defined as the Western world during the Cold War were primarily concerned with combating communist insurgencies. Mao Zedong provided not only an analytical framework, but also an example of how a predominantly rural insurgency could topple a nominally democratic government. Fidel Castro's success in Cuba, a scant distance from the United States, and Che Guevara's popularization of the FOCO, a dedicated revolutionary cadre to lead the rural masses, reinforced this trend. For Western politicians and practitioners fighting the Cold War, communist rural insurgencies were their focus. Decolonization further reinforced the rural outlook of insurgency studies. Most of the territories conquered by the imperial powers were and remain rural. Chronic underinvestment in the colony's infrastructure reinforced this trend. Starting with France's tâche-de-wheel tactics in Algeria in the 19th century, and continuing with Britain's bombing campaigns against Iraqi villages in the 1920s, imperialist powers invariably considered dissent and unrest to be a rural phenomenon. Imperialist powers believed that it was here, away from the urban centers where they had concentrated their strength, that dissent and insurgency were most probable. It was a belief that, we should note, influenced Britain's reaction to the unrest in Cyprus. Against the perceived linkage between socialist gains and decolonization, scholars and practitioners regarded insurgencies that occurred outside this narrow parameter of rural discontent and potential socialist links as aberrations. Scholars neglected Carlos Marighella, a Brazilian revolutionary who sought to bring focus to the potential of urban guerrilla warfare due to his failure in his endeavor. The fact that Marighella's effort was communist-backed, however, at least led scholars and practitioners to examine the potential of urban guerrilla warfare, admittedly in a curt manner. Non-communist insurgencies that received more coverage, or that received less coverage, such as Cyprus, ended up being neglected. The post-Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union did not, as Francis Fukuyama proclaimed, end history. The end of the Cold War, however, did cause conflict scholars and policymakers to reprioritize their analysis, since the United States, in its new role as the global police, found itself woefully unprepared for the situations it found itself in. In Somalia, the United States encountered the problem of facing an urban-based insurgency. It was not the United States alone that found itself wanting in post-Cold War conflicts. Russian forces likewise faced stunning setbacks in Grozny as part of their efforts to subdue Chechnya's efforts to break away from the Russian Federation. These were not isolated phenomena. In a globalized world, warfare has become urban. For much of the 20th century, this was not the case, as cities were a secondary theater for armies. While battles like Stalingrad, Manila, and Berlin have captured the popular imagination, these battles were the exception rather than the norm. Even during these urban battles, while armies would be engaged in urban combat, this represented only a fraction of their strength. In the 21st century, however, we are seeing armies increasingly engage in operations where cities, rather than being secondary targets, are the focus of operations. The Iraqi army efforts against ISIS are but one example of this phenomenon. While scholars debate the reasons for increased prevalence of urban warfare, it has become a new reality. Unfortunately, the newfound interest in urban warfare has been filtered through the needs of the United States. Lessons that were immediately applicable to operations in Mosul and elsewhere were examined first. As studies of terrorism and insurgency evolved away from communist-inspired movements, the fear of religious-backed terrorism and insurgency took hold among policymakers and analysts. This development meant that case studies that did not immediately appear to be such an example, with Cyprus fitting this mold, were once again neglected. While the case studies examined did help policymakers, army officers, and analysts develop immediate solutions to the urban engagements they found themselves participating in, it simultaneously meant that the theoretical perspective on urban warfare was limited. These individuals, instead of understanding the nature of the phenomenon of urban warfare, limited their analysis to what was immediately helpful. Such perspectives did not take into consideration the long-term effects of their actions, which in cases like Iraq and elsewhere are leading to complications today. To have an effective theory, we need to look at a wide variety of examples to test it. If the theory fails to explain certain case studies, we need to return to it and assess where it went wrong. Theories should be developed based on the evidence, not the other way around. EOKA's efforts against the British and Cyprus during the Cold War, therefore, are a neglected example that needs to be brought to the forefront. So I thought I'd first engage with a little bit of a background to the revolt as well, before going into some of the more nuanced dynamics. Cyprus, like most of the territories of the Ottoman Empire, was multi-confessional at the start of the 19th century. The identity of the population had also started to shift. Immediately prior to the 19th century, most of the island's population identified as Muslim. The sincerity of this faith, however, has been questioned by some contemporary scholars, as it appears that significant numbers of the population identify as Muslim to either avoid persecution or for economic gain. By the start of the Greek War of Independence, however, Greek Orthodox Christians increasingly represented a majority of the island's population. By the time that Britain occupied Cyprus in 1878, the Orthodox Christian population of the island was a well-established majority. Simultaneous with the changing demographics of Cyprus was the advent of nationalism in European politics. The Cypriot Orthodox population on the island was not isolated from these developments, and Ottoman policies actually reinforced an emerging modern Greek identity. When several prominent Cypriots left the island to fight in the Greek War of Independence, Ottoman authorities massacred 486 prominent Greek Cypriots, including much of the religious leadership. This had two long-term effects on the island. First, for much of the Orthodox population, it reinforced the burgeoning sense of Greekness. If one is going to be persecuted for their identity, they may as well fully embrace it. The second development is that it started the process of turning the Church of Cyprus against the Ottoman establishment. Religious institutions possessed a privileged position within the Ottoman state. Ottoman authorities, in fact, relied upon religious officials to maintain order over the various groups of the empire. The Church of Cyprus, until this point, had performed this function effectively, albeit with occasional dissent. The massacre of much of its leadership, however, would help turn the Church of Cyprus towards the forces of nationalism. The actions of the Ottomans and the growing sense of Greekness within the Greek-speaking Orthodox population of the Ottoman Empire would be accelerated by the result of the Greek War of Independence. Greek politicians and intellectuals, even while the war is occurring, started to articulate the concept of Nicosia, or union, of all the Greek-speaking territories of the Ottoman Empire. In 1828, Ioannis Kapodistrias, one of the key leaders of the early Greek state, called for Cyprus to be unified with Greece. Although some protests took place in support of this call, they were relatively minor by the standards of the day. Greece's later prime minister, however, Ioannis Koletis' proclamation of the Megali Idea in 1844 would provide a bastion for the idea to flourish, even when it was not acted upon. This belief would find fertile ground among the impoverished Greek-speaking Cypriot population. Political developments, however, would cause the Greek Cypriots to have a new target for their animus, Great Britain. The Ottoman Empire, in order to gain the support of Great Britain at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, granted de facto and quickly de jure control of Cyprus to the British. Although British rule led to considerable economic and social development on the island, it did not eliminate the desire for enosis between Greece and the Greek Cypriot population. Over the next 70 years, numerous moves were made by all parties for various reasons to bring about enosis. Perhaps the two most significant were when Britain promised Cyprus to Greece, in the first case, if it entered the First World War on the side of the Entente. Greece's delay until 1917, however, provided Britain with an excuse not to follow through on this promise. The second was the Octobriana in 1931. The 1931 revolt by Greek Cypriots seeking enosis, known as the 1931 Cypriot Revolt in Britain and the Octobriana in Cyprus, would prove pivotal in providing the foundation for EOKA's efforts in the 1950s. The specific details of the revolt are beyond the scope of this paper. Its legacies, and specifically the British reaction in its aftermath, however, would have a profound effect. Known as the Palmerocracy in Cyprus, it further drove the population against British imperial rule. Even the nominally democratic institutions of the Legislative Assembly and municipal councils were shut down, and efforts were made to suppress the influence of the Church of Cyprus, such as outlawing the assembly of more than 5 individuals. Although many of these restrictions would end during the Second World War, when Cypriots joined the British Army in large numbers and actually played upon these sentiments to encourage recruitment, the British efforts to establish a participatory democracy that did not seek enosis had not only failed, but worked to further alienate the population. This failure and the rising desire for enosis were especially evident in the aftermath of the conflict. For Greek Cypriots who have fought for Britain in order to prevent German domination of Europe, the fact that they were still ruled by a foreign power proved a bitter pill to swallow. Greece, in the aftermath of the Second World War, helped to champion Cypriot desires for enosis, even though most people consider the Megalia Dea to be dead in the aftermath of the Asia Minor catastrophe. King Paul, for example, mentioned in 1948, in the middle of the Greek Civil War, no less, that Cyprus desired to join Greece, and by extension, that the latter desired it as well. This sentiment was confirmed in the 1950 referendum by the Church of Cyprus, which returned results of 97% of Greek Cypriots favoring enosis. While the specific percentage is certainly open for contestation, the overwhelming support it received was reflected in other actions by Greek Cypriots on the island as well. Greece's political position, however, meant that it could not directly act upon such sentiments. Instead, the Cypriot War of Liberation would be led by an unlikely individual, Colonel Yorios Grivas. Grivas, at first glance, did not have the makings of an elite insurgent leader. As a colonel in the Greek army in the 1950s, this was not an ideal starting point. Conventional military officers rarely make effective insurgents. Grivas, however, was not a typical military officer in many regards. Notably, Yorios Grivas was born and raised in Cyprus before moving to Greece and entering the military. Growing up in Cyprus with a mildly affluent family, Grivas, by his own admission, was exposed to Greek nationalist sentiments and became an ardent supporter of enosis. While this provided the ideological background for him to pursue the struggle, it did not provide the direct skill set needed. The Second World War, however, provided these skills. Grivas, like many Greek military officers, found himself stuck in an occupied country after the Axis conquered Greece in 1941. Grivas and General Yorios Lavdas created Organization He, with the latter leaving the group soon after its founding, leaving Grivas largely in control. Originally devoting itself to intelligence gathering, the group soon found itself at odds with the emerging left-wing resistance in Greece, Eomalas. Although the role of Organization He remains controversial to this day, including its role in the security battalions and the Decembriana, it gave Grivas the experience of leading an insurgency while simultaneously familiarizing him with the dynamics of Greek politics. Knowledge in both these areas would assist him when he founded EOKA. While Grivas himself was an exceptional leader for EOKA, it should be noted that he himself is part of the reason that the organization's exploits are not better known today. To put it mildly, Grivas was highly arrogant and an egotistical individual. His memoirs and accounts of the campaign frequently assign himself the pivotal role and question whether success would have been possible without his leadership. Grievous's point about the importance of his leadership is not without merit. Simultaneously, however, the arrogance with which he conducted his affairs and the marginalization of other key figures in the Cyprus liberation struggle, most notably Archbishop Makarios, both undermined his contributions and helped transform what was a military success into a contributing factor in the issues that Cyprus faces today. While the population of Cyprus was largely in favor of Enosis, Britain's geostrategic concerns meant that it would not surrender the island easily. Great Britain, in the aftermath of the Second World War, was a country riven by competing policies. Although individuals within the Foreign Office were amenable to granting Cyprus independence, simultaneously they were countered by their own colleagues within the ministry, as also those within the Ministry of Defense as well. Crucially, the British Empire had previously relied upon forces in Alexandria and the Suez for much of the previous 70 years to maintain control of the Eastern Mediterranean. The 1952 Egyptian Revolution, however, meant that Britain would no longer be able to use these facilities. Egypt's eventual leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, charted an Egyptian foreign policy independent of British entanglements. Britain, to make sure it preserved its position of influence in the Middle East, announced in 1954 that it was moving the office of the Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East from Suez to Cyprus. Cyprus went from being a complementary piece in Britain's global ambitions, however misplaced, to now being crucial to its efforts. As such, despite the increasing pressure from both Greece and the Cypriots themselves, British forces refused to yield on the issue. One of the aspects of Great Britain's efforts to maintain control over Cyprus that have continued to plague the country to the present was their efforts to play on, and in many instances create, ethnic tensions on the island. By the time that Guerrilla launched his insurrection on 1 April 1955, the Turkish population constituted approximately 18% of the island's total population. While relations between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots were not perfect, the populations were effectively mixed throughout the island. Britain, in its efforts to maintain the island under its dominion, however, magnified these cleavages. This practice was not a novel development. Great Britain had long maintained divide and rule as part of its imperial handbook. Great Britain would have assistance in this regard, however, in that the Turkish Cypriot population possessed an external patron, Turkey. Turkey, initially, did not possess any standing on the Cypriot question. As part of the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey renounced all claims to the territorial possessions outside its territories, specifically those with a Hellenic presence. Cyprus was included in this list. Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, had in fact encouraged the Turkish population of Cyprus to leave the island in the 1920s and 30s as part of his efforts to consolidate his rule over all the Turkish people. Britain, however, both covertly and overtly encouraged Turkey to become engaged in the Cypriot question to maintain its influence and rule. While Britain's efforts were successful in involving Turkey in a matter that was beyond its legal rights, it would not help Britain maintain its rule on the island in the long term. Instead, much like British and American efforts in the region more broadly, short-term policy objectives would create intractable long-term complications that continue to impact them, and more importantly, the people of Cyprus to this day. Britain did not solely encourage Turkey to become involved in Cyprus, but actively promoted the interests of the Turkish Cypriot population and encouraged tensions between them and the Greek Cypriots to justify Turkish involvement. British authorities encouraged the Turkish Cypriots to join the police forces and the government administration. Not only did this increase the Turkish Cypriots' stake in the existing government, but it also made the Turkish Cypriot casualties increasingly unavoidable in EOKA's insurgency campaign. This development, in turn, provided Turkey with a moral justification for intervening politically on the island. Perhaps the best example of Great Britain's efforts to weaponize the Turkish Cypriots was in the various paramilitary groups that the Turkish Cypriots created. Between 1956 and 1958, Turkish Cypriots founded numerous paramilitary groups for protection in an increasingly fratricidal struggle. Groups such as Vulcan, the 9 September Front, the Karachete, the Black Gang, and the Turkish Resistance Organization sought to protect the Turkish Cypriots, but also went on the offensive against EOKA, specifically, and the Greek Cypriots more generally. Britain's efforts to weaponize the Turkish Cypriots are evident in the fact that despite the various Turkish paramilitary units committed acts of a criminal nature that were comparable, if not exceeding EOKA, British authorities rarely prosecuted such groups. In fact, in several instances, British authorities provided direct support to them in their efforts to suppress EOKA. These actions by the British, despite Grievous's efforts to limit the inter-island struggle between the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, would engender a cycle of violence that would culminate in the 1974 invasion of the island by Turkey. Given these kind of constraints, what EOKA actually accomplished is actually quite impressive. This is all the more so, given that the material conditions EOKA possessed to start the revolt were lacking in both quantity and quality. Cyprus, being an island, also made it difficult for significant arms to reach the insurgents. Even if they possessed significant external patronage, the strength of the Royal Navy meant supplies could, at best, be obtained at a trickle. The earlier noted lack of material strength throughout the struggle would help to condition their approach to conflict. Open rebellion and the creation of liberated zones, such as what EOMA last did in Greece and the partisans did in Yugoslavia during the Second World War, were impossible. Quite simply, if EOKA established such zones, the British would be able to deploy their superior conventional forces to rapidly suppress the revolt. Complicating matters for Grievous was that the support that EOKA received from Greece was, at best, moral, and at other times completely lacking in materiality. This point bears note, as a common refrain in insurgency literature is that a guerrilla force needs a secure base, specifically one provided by a sympathetic state, to succeed. EOKA, by all measures, lacked this crucial feature. Greece did, however, keep the issue alive in the international realm, specifically at the United Nations. Greece made persistent efforts in the 1950s to raise the Cypriot issue at the United Nations, although Britain and the United States largely blocked such endeavors. The fact that the Cypriot struggle was tied to the broader phenomenon of decolonization, however, kept it in the international news, as Britain's actions were regarded from this perspective. The fact that Cyprus was tied to an international opinion that increasingly turned against imperial powers provided Grievous and EOKA with an avenue for success. Contrary to most insurgency movements of the Cold War, and in fact most insurgency movements up until that point, Grievous concentrated EOKA's actions in the cities of Cyprus. On 1 April 1955, Grievous announced EOKA's existence to the British authorities by coordinating 4 near simultaneous attacks in the cities and British military facilities in Cyprus. These attacks did little to immediately destabilize Britain's military position on the island. War is, however, a continuation of politics by our means. In this regard, Grievous recognized the political circumstances of his era. International news covered the attacks almost immediately after they occurred. While much of the news coverage, particularly in the British press, condemned Grievous's actions, it laid bare the fact that Britain's proclamation that everything was well on the island was false. In this regard, the decision of Grievous and his reason for focusing his efforts on the urban centers became clear. In urban centers, there was a much greater chance of the attacks receiving international news coverage than if they occurred in the countryside. Attacks in the city, even if they were unsuccessful, helped to create a climate of fear that reporters could still engage with, no matter the outcome. International attention was, in fact, the primary goal of EOKA. In the organization's preliminary general plan of insurrectionary action, which was established before the organization came into existence, Grievous noted, quote, "By deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice to draw the attention of the international public opinion, especially among the allies of Greece, to the Cyprus question, which might prove a source of trouble to them unless a settlement were found that satisfied our claims. By continually harassing the British in Cyprus, we must show that we are firmly determined not to yield, whatever the sacrifice, but that on the contrary, we are prepared to continue until our aim is attained. The struggle will be carried on until international diplomacy, exercised through United Nations, and the British in particular, is compelled to examine the Cyprus problem and reach a speedy settlement in accordance with the aspirations of the Cypriot people and the whole Greek nation." End quote. Individual acts, as can be drawn from this, matter less than whether they received adequate attention in the international media. In this regard, Grievous's choice to focus on the cities made it far more likely that for the international media to witness the attacks, and thus for them to receive coverage to pursue the goal of EOKA. Specifically, the attacks that EOKA committed in the cities were typically one of two models. The first, and generally most common, was sabotage. For Grievous and EOKA, sabotage had a broad meaning. Grievous, in explaining the sabotage strategy, notes, quote, "Sabotage will be undertaken by special groups which will preferably remain in the town and village areas where they will operate. Only in the imminent danger of discovery shall the groups or some of their members withdraw to places fixed in advance for each group, and from there, if need be, to the mountain areas where the guerrilla units are stationed. Targets will be selected by the leader himself in view of their importance and that of the expected results." End quote. Targets of opportunity were the focus, and the key was not to get eliminated in the act. In so doing, Grievous embraced a key aspect of insurgency doctrine. One only loses if they are eliminated. Retreat and relocation are part of the course, and Cyprus's mountain redoubts gave them such an area. The second, and one that required more planning on EOKA's part to execute, were targeted assassinations. Conducted by so-called execution groups, these individuals were recruited not so much for their individual combat skills, but rather their ability to blend into the crowd. While EOKA attempted to eliminate high-ranking officials, such as the colonial governor Harding, equally important to EOKA's efforts were targeting off-duty British military and police personnel. These actions had the double effect of creating international news, while isolating the British from the rest of the population. As the assassination efforts continue, British authorities were forced to withdraw their troops from the public sphere, and it laid false to claim that it continued to be a British possession in areas outside the military encampments and government offices. Given the danger and public nature of both of these actions, EOKA could not have succeeded without the support of the local Greek Cypriot population. The fact was one of the reasons that Grievous disproportionately targeted Greek Cypriots who aligned with the British versus the Cypriots themselves. While Grievous claimed that they were traitors that all Greek Cypriots despise, at the time targeting said individuals helped to create a climate of fear amongst Greek Cypriots. Grievous, in other words, gave Greek Cypriots only one path forward. The ethics of such a stance can be questioned, but the results cannot. Grievous reinforced the Greek Cypriots' loyalty to EOKA and their ultimate goal of Nicosia. While these urban attacks were critical to EOKA receiving attention from the international community, the disparity in force size between them and the British meant that EOKA could not solely focus on the cities. If EOKA limited its activities to the urban environment, the superior resources of the British Crown Colony, up to and including their soldiers, police officers, government officials, Turkish Cypriot paramilitaries, etc., would quickly isolate and eliminate them, regardless of the support of the Greek Cypriot population. Thus, crucial to EOKA's efforts were the ambushes of British forces and government officials in the countryside. This had two effects. First, as mentioned, it prevented the British from concentrating their forces in the urban cities. Instead of policing Nicosia, Famagusta, etc., Britain was forced to extend their operations throughout the island. Furthermore, as mentioned in the discussion of the sabotage units, it provided a key point for EOKA forces to retreat to in case pressure became too severe in the cities. In essence, the mountainous areas of Cyprus became the secure base for EOKA that was normally provided for another country. The reason for the success of the first point was the second point. It played into British counterinsurgency beliefs that the true threat arose in the countryside. British experiences from counterinsurgency during this period were conditioned by viewing insurgency as a world phenomenon. The contemporaneous Malayan and Kenyan emergencies primarily took place in the countryside of those respective countries. Furthermore, the success of Mao in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and his advocacy for a rural uprising conditioned British commanders to focus their efforts in these areas. Grievous, by providing a rural dimension to EOKA's operations, caused the British to constantly misread the center of EOKA's military operations. The British, instead of focusing on EOKA's true center of gravity, the cities where there was a significant population for them to hide and potential for international attention, wasted their efforts in conducting sweep operations in the countryside. Unsurprisingly, the British, despite some minor tactical success in the countryside, failed to eliminate EOKA. So, looking at these dynamics, I think there are several key lessons that one can draw from what was, by all measures, a successful military insurgency by EOKA. We need to distinguish between military and political. The first is that, contrary to contemporary expectations about insurgencies and guerrilla warfare, the divide between rural and urban is not as pronounced as has been regularly argued. Yes, urban and rural conditions create different requirements. Cyprus, as a relatively small island, meant that Grievous, in order to maximize the pressure on the British, had to engage them throughout the island. Cyprus's small size and resulting necessity of blending urban and rural efforts, however, should not dissuade scholars of its importance to contemporary military actions. One of the issues that is facing not only conflict studies, but the world more broadly, is the phenomenon of globalization. Strict geographic distances, in short, are being shrunk due to technological advances and increased infrastructure throughout the world. The relatively small size of Cyprus is thus applicable to more environments throughout the world now than it appears at first glance. Perhaps the most important lesson that comes from the case of Cyprus is recognizing the importance of military success versus political success. EOKA's military campaign was, without question, a military success. With minimal resources, EOKA frequently achieved disproportionate military results against the British on Cyprus. Whether this was the destruction and sabotage of British jets, or something as simple as ambushes conducted by shotgun squads, EOKA managed to constantly keep British forces on their back heel. More importantly, they made the island ungovernable for the British authorities through their constant pressure. Crucially, however, EOKA was never able to turn this military success into a political one in the long term. EOKA succeeded in bringing the British to the negotiating table. EOKA's political partners, most notably the Greek government and Archbishop Makarios, however, were forced to agree to what amounted to an unworkable long-term solution. EOKA's greatest failure, in many ways, was not determining before the conflict if it would be able to convert its military success into a political one. That said, EOKA does not deserve the entirety of the blame for this development. War is an interaction between different forces, and British policy was crucial in limiting EOKA's success to their long-term detriment. For Britain to disrupt EOKA and the Greek Cypriots' goals, they had to maximize all the resources at their disposal without consideration of the long-term consequences of their actions. Employing the politics of divide and rule, for example, created cleavages that, if they existed before, were now irreconcilable. Britain's employment of Cypriot Turks against the Greek Cypriots created a foundation for an unworkable polity and an eventual division of the island. The division, however, would not have been possible without the second fatal flaw in British strategy, their introduction of Turkey into the Cypriot question. As noted, Turkey possessed no legal standing on the matter. Britain, however, in an effort to obtain a maximalist victory in Cyprus, managed through political deception and admittedly a bad decision on Greece's part to make them an active participant in the matter. Maximalist goals, in the face of protracted insurgency, are often a fool's errand. The recent U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel and Gaza, and the Russians in Chechnya were all demonstrative of this point. What Cyprus effectively demonstrates is that in the face of a protracted insurgency, maximalist goals are often counterproductive. This point is not to say it's impossible. Russia and Iran's support of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria is demonstrative that such policies and goals can be achieved. The problem, however, is the excess and blatant human rights violations and war crimes needed to make such a policy work. Given the rightful unwillingness of the Western states to go to such extremes and the increased likelihoods of casualties as guerrilla warfare becomes more urbanized, EOKA's campaign between 1955 and 1959 teaches us as much about what an insurgent group can do to succeed as what a counterinsurgent should not do in their effort to suppress it. In conclusion, insurgency and its natural counterpart, counterinsurgency, are always evolving, and recent trends are to emphasize its urban dimension. The recent shift to urban insurgency, however, does not mean that it is a novel phenomenon, and EOKA's successful military insurgency between 1955 and 1959 is demonstrative of this point. EOKA's tactics are not necessarily novel and can be replicated elsewhere, as recent actions in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Russia demonstrate. Nevertheless, EOKA also demonstrates that as much as an urban environment can be a haven, it can be successfully supplemented by a broader effort that maximizes the ability of the people to resist. In this instance, General Grievous and EOKA mobilized the Greek Cypriots throughout the island, whether rural or urban, for a military victory. Given that many individuals are likely to ignore the potential long-term issues created by this victory, studying how EOKA conducted its campaign is imperative for both scholars and policymakers today. Thank you. I'd now like to open up for any potential questions that either the attendees, panelists, or anybody else may have regarding the paper or anything related to kind of Cyprus today. Yes, Katie.
Thank you. Wow, that was a lot of complexity, information, so much to comprehend. I wonder, is your paper available, the recording available for us?
We plan to have the recording available later. I'm turning this into initially a paper. Actually, I'm planning to go to a conference in Cyprus. I've been working on it later in November, but I'm hoping to turn it into a manuscript long-term, actually.
Wow, it's phenomenal. Congratulations, it's an excellent paper.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions?
Sorry, I was muted earlier.
No worries, Faye.
I was going to say, kind of along the lines of the Consul General here. The country, such small country in such a strategic location, fought over by major powers over the decades, then during their own major swings, political swings in their the pendulum of political swings. What that teaches us, I think, currently is that a small country has to be so aware of the winds of change and how impactful they are for their own dreams. We all have dreams. Every political party does. Every struggling community does. The idea, though, that to achieve a certain level of independence, etc., requires a lot of work, and to know how many people are behind you as a small nation or a community. That goes without, like, I mean, the amount of importance in that, I think people kind of forget every few years how impactful that is. I was going to ask you personally, currently, because of the massive changes going on very close by not in Cyprus, but over in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of us are aware that there have been, in the last 2 years especially, massive amounts of Israeli migrants, Jewish migrants, etc., that or who they themselves feel like a brand new set of people who are being controlled by warfare and the outside superpowers, if you will. So I was hoping if you could give us or shed some light a little bit about what you personally know is going on currently.
Yeah, because of Cyprus's kind of key geostrategic position, it's gotten pulled into the ongoing conflict within Israel-Palestine in a couple of different ways. First is in terms of basically supplies that are trying to end up reaching Palestine for humanitarian purposes. Cyprus has been at the forefront in trying to help facilitate humanitarian aid and should be commended in that regard. However, it's also complicated in some regards by its position within the EU and the feeling amongst, in particular, supporters of Palestine that the EU has not done enough to basically halt what's been going on within Palestine. This has caused, in particular, Hezbollah to try to use Cyprus in order to create pressure upon the EU more broadly to kind of change its policies. The first was earlier this year, where I'm not sure if many people are aware, but there's been a significant uptick in terms of refugees and migrants attempting to enter the EU through Cyprus. Hezbollah actually threatened earlier in the year that they should end up basically sending refugees from the Syrian civil war in Lebanon to Cyprus as a way of creating pressure upon the EU. There's no real kind of official policy that I've seen with that regards with Hezbollah, but it's something that they're keeping as a threat in terms of weaponizing basically this refugee population. And recently, actually, Hezbollah came out and directly ended up threatening Cyprus, basically trying to more or less put pressure upon Cyprus and more broadly the EU to change its stance with regards to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I regard it as more kind of directed to the EU, and unfortunately, Cyprus is kind of being pulled in because of its being the most, or the country most proximate to Lebanon. Did that answer the question, Fanny?
Yes, yes, yes. I was just even going to ask as well. I know there are other people that would like to ask things.
Just got a question here, actually.
Yeah, go
From
ahead.
I'll just read on. David Mirhardi says, when we think about the French experience in Algeria at the close at the same time, we ask, why did they bother? You detail why Cyprus was important for Britain strategically. Could both sides have anticipated the current situation, which seems to benefit both sides? In terms of both sides kind of foreseeing this situation, do you mean specifically with regards to kind of Cyprus and Britain, Cyprus and Greece? I'm not sure in terms of what is meant by both sides. If we're talking about kind of the politics of division, it was an unfortunate kind of legacy, I would say. Cyprus and Britain. Okay, perfect. Thank you there. In terms of could have been anticipated by both sides, I think from the Cypriot perspective, there was certain accommodations that were willing to end up being reached with Britain. One of the things that there was a certain kind of narrow focus within Britain that there needed to be a maximalist policy in order to have the military bases, which they also end up drawing the United States in eventually. They end up having listening facilities. And they thought that the only way that could have been preserved is through their domination of the island. And actually one of the key features of the agreements that basically end up ending the conflict is for the establishment of basically permanent British military bases on the island. I don't think that basically kind of stark division was inevitable, that specifically in terms of Britain likely could have still maintained its military bases, but in the aftermath of losing the Suez Canal as well, its bases within Egypt, there was a fear that it basically had to stop and only wanted to end up pursuing kind of this maximalized plan for maintaining its influence in the region. In order to do so, they're willing to basically do anything and not compromise with the Greek Cypriot population, when arguably kind of the Greek Cypriot population would have been willing to compromise, especially given the fact that the United States already had bases within Greece, and if the desire was a no-cease, this could have easily been arranged. there any other questions as well? Oh, Fanny, you have another question?
I did. I was going to ask if you are predicting, because now with Europe or the European Parliament that has been voted in, that is more right-wing, more nationalistic, with amongst the more populated countries governing, or the superpowers, if you will. Do you have your predictions about how perhaps the next, let's say, 6 months could go?
Oh,
And
predictions.
their support, or support of Cyprus, in terms of being more protective.
I think you'll definitely see them try to be more protective of Cyprus. I mean, there's already been initiatives under the previous kind of EU policies to try to make sure, given that it is within the EU. I think you'll see some gestures. I'm not sure how much of an immediate impact that they're going to make. Typically, the policies end up taking several months in order to see it through. And kind of, if we're dealing with, for example, the migration issue, it'll take months before actual policy catches up with what's going on. They still haven't caught up. And then you end up having a shift within the migration season. I think in terms of major changes with regards to that, we're likely going to be waiting beyond 6 months. I mean, there might be some policies if they act in a rapid manner, but one can't be certain with regards to the EU. In terms of the military dimension with regards to Hezbollah, I honestly hope things do not become escalated. I don't think Hezbollah would. The strategic kind of goal is it's much better for them to threaten Cyprus than to basically actually engage in military acts, because once you basically end up going down that path, it severely limits your political options. We saw this, for example, once Russia ended up invading Ukraine, their political options became much less than when they were previously threatening them. That said, these developments are contingent upon multiple other factors within the region, such as what is continuing to go on within Israel-Palestine, how basically Israel ends up pursuing its attacks within Palestine, how basically the government of Israel deals with the withdrawal of different parties from its government. So there's a lot of moving pieces. I wish I could give you kind of a bit firmer answer, but there's so many moving pieces, it's difficult to kind of foresee that far into the future with any degree of confidence.
Of course, like you said, lots of moving pieces currently, and obviously we all hope that things will be less acrimonious for all the places that are involved currently in warfare, or that are being affected by the Middle East wars currently. Katie, any other points that you would like to make?
Oh, thank you, Fanny. Well, I think again, it's very complex, and we look at 50 years of this. Some would say is successful. It hasn't turned into what we're seeing globally. So on the one hand, we have to say it is a success, but again, on the other hand, what does it take? Negotiations have been going on with UN generally assemblies, security resolutions, and globally condemnations, and all the rhetoric that we do see and we follow, and like our House of Commons resolution that was passed unanimously. All these things continue politically. The question is, will it ever resolve? And when we have what's happening with Hezbollah, very concerning to us on a global scale, despite the fact that it is a small island. So Dr. Horncastle, you brought a lot of interesting concepts and principles, and this concept of the urban guerrilla warfare, and so much to think about. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
And if there's anybody else who would like to ask any questions before we part?
Peter, I just saw has a hand raised there. Peter, yes, I think here. Yeah, there we go. I think you'll soon be able to talk if you turn on your mic there, Peter.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
since the West is freaking out with Russia invading the Ukrainian-speaking people, with exactly that Turkey did the same thing, basically. And I mean, the protests here is everybody's freaking out about Russia and the Ukraine. Why hasn't there been universal protests with Turkey doing the same thing, basically? And is there any hope in the future? I don't know.
I can speak from at least kind of one of the political dynamics, and in terms of with regards to Turkey's kind of position within the Middle East, there's been efforts to actively end up courting them in pursuit of basically broader policy objectives. That said, it's complicated by Turkish domestic politics. There was kind of a great celebration recently within, at least initially in the media, about the recent elections within Turkey, how Erdogan's party basically suffered considerable losses. That said, all the support in those losses also went to other nationalist parties. And for basically the Turkish nationalists, Cyprus remains basically one of their kind of key focal points. So it's very difficult to create pressure upon Turkey, given that they're trying to use Turkey for broader political reasons with the United States, Great Britain more broadly, NATO, etc.
Yeah, I guess Turkey is more important.
They're trying to play kind of strategically and use it for broader regional goals, yes.
I see, yeah. So basically there's very little hope, as you say.
I still have hope. I mean, you're starting to see, as you see through these resolutions, there's the issues being kept alive. While the issue's kept alive, there still is hope. That said, you're dealing with some very complicated political processes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. If there's no final questions, I just want to thank everybody for listening to me today. Honestly, it's great to have this talk here. I specifically want to thank Fanny as well as Katie for coming. It was great to have this discussion here, and thank you everybody for your questions. Any final comments from Katie or Fanny, or?
I have to say thank you on behalf of the Hellenic Canadian Congress of BC. This was a very comprehensive talk that you gave, a presentation that you gave in such a small amount of time. The issues are so complex. The country itself of Cyprus, how can you encompass everything and make everybody understand currently the fight for its survival as a peaceful group in a very strategic location. It's well done. Thank you very much, Professor. And we look forward this coming year to communicating with you, working closely with you, including obviously together with the Honorable Consul General of Cyprus, Katie Arsoniadis, and of course with the Consul General of Greece as well, the consulate here in Vancouver. We look forward to many more much more new information coming from you, and also the Hellenic Studies chair and department. So I was very happy tonight. Thank you. Katie, before we leave tonight?
Thank you, Fanny. And again, Dr. Horncastle, wonderful presentation, a lot for us to take away and think about as we continue to have faith that the Cypriot problem will be solved. I think we have to carry that with us and continuously encourage our leaders to do whatever needs to be done to solve this, so that Cyprus can be free within our European family and the global community.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everybody, the BC Hellenic Congress, the Honorary Consul General, and for everybody, have a great evening. I look forward to having more of these discussions in the future with everybody. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well done. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for tuning in from wherever you were.
Yeah.